7.
A 7. John, the topic we will be discussing today that your die roll has just determined is, how do you use fear at the gaming table?
Ooh, all right. I'm excited.
Yeah, this should be an interesting one. I don't remember when we added this, but it should be a good discussion.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, I'm ready.
Hello and welcome to Roll for Topic, a podcast in which we discuss topics related to running tabletop role-playing games. My name is Andy Rao.
And I'm John Corey.
And we are back this week with John continuing to temporarily take the place of Chris as co-host of the show.
Very temporary.
Chris has taken some time off to be a new father, and I'm happy to report that young baby Chris was born healthily and seems to be doing well, and father and mother are doing great.
I saw them today, actually, in
did you?
person, from 10 feet apart. But yeah, I dropped them dinner today and chatted with Chris for 15 minutes.
What was your take on how they're doing? Did they look, haggard and worn down from parenting a new infant, or did they seem to be doing okay?
They seem to be doing okay. I talked mostly with Chris and his daughter.
Excellent.
She seemed in good spirits, so that's a good sign.
Good.
Yeah, Chris and I just chatted about how everybody was doing, and then I talked to his wife for 30 seconds. And
yeah.
I did see the boy. He's very
Okay.
cute and very little, and but they seem to be doing good. So
okay.
Yeah.
Was the baby dressed in any sort of cheesy gamer onesie?
Disappointingly, no. Okay. And I think we should take that up with Chris when he returns.
I think so. We might have to do a podcast fundraiser to buy some schlocky gaming garb for Chris's baby. Well, so listeners, rest assured Chris is doing well. And John, thank you again for being willing to cover for Chris. I appreciate
thanks
it.
for having me. I'm excited.
You bet. So, John, before we jump into our topic, I wanted to toss a question in your direction.
Yes.
It is about friendly local gaming stores. Over the last couple of days, I've discovered that the local gaming stores in my hometown are starting to slowly reopen. I am lucky enough. Yeah, I'm lucky enough to have a couple of them within close range of me, and they're reopening, and they seem to be doing it pretty safely, I guess. There's hand sanitizer at the door. You have to wear masks. There's a limit on the amount of time you're supposed to be in there and the number of customers. So I visited two of them this week, and I couldn't believe how good it felt to just roam the aisles again. So yeah. I'm curious, what is your local game store situation like, and have you been missing them? Does that normally play a big role in sort of your gaming hobby, or not so much?
It comes and goes. The main one in Ann Arbor, there's two that I like. There's Fun for All, and then there's Vault of Midnight. I no longer buy comic books. I stopped doing that maybe a year ago. So I go to Vault of Midnight, which is primarily a comic book store, way less than I used to. But I do enjoy going there. They do have an entire, it's not a huge shelf, but a big sort of section dedicated to role-playing games. A lot of gaming stores and a lot of companies, right? They're more dedicated to board games when it comes to gaming.
Sure.
But they do make an effort to have some of the indie stuff there. I remember I bought a copy of Night Witches there a while ago, and so they do keep in print rare, sort of more indie games that I'm into. I bought my copy of Dungeon World there. So I do like going there and browsing and seeing what they've got every once in a while. I don't do it that often, but I do. There's something about the physical tangibility of being able to look at a book before you buy it that I really enjoy. If I buy something online, it's usually the PDF, and then I usually end up filing it away and not reading it. But if I want a physical book, I always try to go to one of my stores. The other one, Fun for All, is good. They do a better job of stocking sort of large amounts of the bigger titles and maybe less of the indie stuff. I can tell you about the most frustrating game store in the world. It's not in Ann Arbor. It's up north, and I won't say the city, but I go in there and they have a copy of the Rules Cyclopedia. And it's really beat up.
Wow. Okay.
And I think I've been in there 4 times now over the years, and it's still there. And they don't price it. They pull it out, and then, which I think is illegal. But anyway, she looks on the internet and says, "Oh, this is worth this much on eBay," and I'm like, "I'll give you $10 for it because you've had this here for," but she never does.
Oh, man.
And so I would really like to have a physical copy of that book, but am unwilling to pay the extreme amounts of money that it would take me. So
yeah,
I do miss the used gaming store, because I did buy a copy of Champions at a used gaming store not that long ago, and it's the original version, and it's just fantastic.
I feel like the gaming stores that are still around that have survived, for the most part, have kind of upped their game.
Yes.
Because, but there are, again, I won't mention any names, but there is a store I used to frequent a lot that I would go in there, in the last couple of years, and they would have books that I remember being in there when I was in college visiting the same store in the mid 90s.
Yeah.
No effort to, discount that or just clear the space out. I don't want this to be a gripe fest about gaming stores, because I feel that if game stores are still in business, it means they've kind of gotten their act together about, inventory and using it wisely. So
yeah, one thing that, not to turn this into an ad for Vault of Midnight, but one thing they do is on Free RPG Day, they have they call it I forget what they call it, the something lounge, but anyway, the basement of the store. Mm-hmm. They set up some gaming tables and invite people into play for a small fee, and I've run games there 2 years running. So I, maybe this year Free RPG Day they'll be allowed to have gatherings like this, though I would be surprised. Yeah. But, if they had that, I would do that again in a heartbeat, because I love the opportunity to run games in that setting.
So one last question about friendly gaming stores. Thinking across your whole life and the whole amount of time you've been in the hobby, what is the best gaming store you've ever been in?
It is so easy to answer this question. It is Riders Hobby on Liberty in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Okay. And what makes it so great?
Well, what made it so great is it was the first, because of nostalgia, basically.
Yeah.
But it was a classic hobby shop, and it was the first place I encountered role-playing games, right? That is the only place you could buy them, because they weren't at the bookstore. They weren't at any place like that. So all the original D&D books and the D&D modules, and my first game that wasn't D&D, a game called Dragon Quest, was recommended to me by Dean, the RPG guy who worked at Riders Hobby. And, you could go in there and chat about RPGs, and it was super nerdy back then. And so to have an opportunity to have a place where there were people there who wanted to talk about it and would wax philosophical about them was amazing. So that will always be my favorite place to go, because I got all my favorite games there when I was really young. And it was Riders with a Y, just for
okay.
I don't know why.
We have a Riders over in my town as well. I think that they used to be sort of a Michigan small chain, but I think they're down to just one or two locations now. But
I think you're right.
Yeah, that's probably my main friendly local gaming store as well. And they're mostly trains and airplanes, but there's a gaming shelf, and I know they're one game guy.
Yeah.
I will share, and it's probably time for us to jump into our topic, but the best game store I've ever had the joy of living near was Games Plus in Chicago. When I was in Chicago for a couple of years at grad school in the 90s, Games Plus was just an incredible place to go and just spend hours in, because at that time in the 90s, you couldn't easily just order anything you wanted online.
Right.
And so a game store that was willing to go out and get all those weird indie games that were hard to get, that was like a really valuable service. And it was also a great way to discover new stuff, because the internet wasn't quite to the point where it is now, where we all know like 2 years in advance the publishing schedule of every company.
Right.
Right. So,
right.
And they're still there. I haven't been there in a long time. When I go through Chicago, if the stars align, I do try to stop in. Yeah, that was a great place. So
awesome.
All right. Well, hey, thanks everyone for listening to us reminisce about friendly local gaming stores. I hope you have a great gaming store, and I hope that it is being safe and smart, but also, about reopening in this era of the pandemic. But
yes.
John, why don't we make a complete topic switch from a happy, joyous topic to a much more scary one, and talk about using fear at the game table. And so let me start out by just lobbing a general question at you. When have you employed fear at the table? Just tell us about when you've done it and how it went.
I do it almost constantly. I think it's important to, not all the time, I shouldn't say constantly. I do it in every game that I play, whether it's a horror game or not. And I actually tend to make even fantasy games a little more scary and horror-like. I know we're not specifically talking about horror games, but I think it's a great motivator in a role-playing game to create fear, but it can be really hard to do that. But I like to do it because I think it's important that there be consequences to drive the players to do something else. And often it's fear. If you don't do this, this bad thing is going to occur, and create fear that way. And I often will up the stakes of that by creating an actual fearful thing, right? Create the monster or the setting or the whatever is going to happen be actually scary in a more traditional sense. So how about you?
Yeah, well, when this topic came up, my mind went immediately to horror role-playing games. And the predominant horror game I've run is Call of Cthulhu.
Of course.
But you're right. I don't think we should confine this talk to horror games because fear is a powerful motivator in basically any kind of story. But yes, the main place where I've employed it or seen it employed has been in horror games like Call of Cthulhu. One of the questions I want us to talk about is to what extent, as a GM, you target your fear towards the players who are sitting at the table with you versus at the characters that they're playing. But yeah, fear is a big part of a horror game like Call of Cthulhu. It's in the case of Call of Cthulhu, it's mechanically enforced. There's mechanisms for determining how afraid or insane your character is becoming.
Right.
So it's a part of basically every Call of Cthulhu game I've run. And to answer my own question, I've rarely seen efforts to spook players at the table.
Right.
But every now and then you do get these sort of serendipitous moments where you realize that you have, without maybe trying, created a really tense experience. The sort of fear that you might have watching a good horror movie.
Yeah. I think fear is a really, on one hand, easy because it can, there's a lot of different vectors here. I'm going to start with non-horror games because I have two thoughts right off the bat about non-horror games, and then I had some interesting horror experiences. I ran a Halloween game this year that I'd like to get into. So real quick, fear, I think of actually instilling fear in the players. I've had a couple times where that's worked. I'm really more trying to instill fear in the characters, though occasionally I'll have a player go, oh, or ew, or, sort of be slightly taken aback, and I'll take that as a message that I'm doing all right, that I've created a circumstance that is fearful. And I think that makes for a good game because it makes for tension that drives the action forward. With a lot of players, and it really depends on the player, there are some players who really don't want, their characters are very much like a new car to them, and they don't want to get a scratch on it. And so fear can actually induce conservatism in play. And so if you don't know who you're playing with and you don't know what they're after in the game, you could create a fearful circumstance and they're like, well, I'm not doing that. Let's go shopping or whatever. So those are my first two thoughts about fear is that I think it's a great motivator, but it can also create situations where players are unwilling to take risks depending on the circumstance.
Even without fear exactly being the emotion you're trying to evoke, there is an interesting challenge when running RPGs in that the sort of stuff you want the players to be doing is the sort of stuff that a regular person would never, ever do.
Right.
Nobody would go into the dungeon,
Right, who's going into the dungeon? Yeah, right. Nobody.
Tell me about a specific time that you had a really good experience inspiring fear, either in the players or the characters, or maybe a little bit of both.
Well, how about I'll actually go to my Halloween game because this was a good experience for me. And we played a game this Halloween called 10 Candles. Have you heard of it?
I have, yes.
For those who don't know what it is, what you do is it's a narrative RPG game, and the plot of it is that the world has ended and the power is gone, and the plot of the game is the characters are trying to escape or do whatever they want to do until, it always ends badly. And it says this in the beginning of the game, it's not if you're going to get killed, but how you're going to get killed is sort of the plot of it. It's a bit gruesome, but there's two mechanics in it that are great, and the thing I love about it is you allow players to create that fear for themselves a little bit. So one of the first things you do is you take a voice recorder and you pass it around and you say, okay, what are your last words that were recorded? And everybody at the beginning of the game records something. Then the phone goes away and you light 10 candles and you turn off all the lights. And in certain narrative moments, you blow out a candle, and when all the candles are gone, the game is over, and you replay the recordings that were played. So it was very cool, and it created a lot of fear. But the one moment I'll say there is, I said to somebody, what are you going to do? And he just takes a big breath like, I don't know. And one of the candles blows out. And he goes, can we relight it? And I'm like, no, we don't. It doesn't matter if the candle blew out because of the game rules or accidentally, it's out. And there was just this long pause, like everybody suddenly took the game much more seriously. And I thought that was That was really fun. I enjoyed that moment because it was, I wouldn't say it was genuine fear, but it was a genuine realization like, there's no going back here.
I had a similar experience recently with a Call of Cthulhu game where it obviously was much less atmospheric than that 10 Candles, which sounds phenomenal, by the way. That sounds like the perfect Halloween game. But yeah, in the case I'm thinking of, it was a Call of Cthulhu game, and it was proceeding pretty normally, with that sort of, it's mostly serious, but there's a certain jokey slapstickness that creeps into most games. We've talked about it on this show in the past. But at some point, out of the blue, I had one of the PCs get, basically a monster jumped out and horrifically killed one of the PCs. That it was a pivotal moment in the evening's game because it was sort of the moment where everyone realized, oh, hey, this is for real. He turned his character sheet over to me, and I didn't have to keep having them get ambushed with monsters after that. It's like in a good horror movie where you're thrown off kilter when somebody you think was going to survive through the end of the movie gets abruptly killed by the monster a little ways in.
Yeah.
What are some things that you try to do or you try to avoid if you're hoping to evoke that feeling of fear?
Yeah, I think the one big thing to avoid, and I learned this in sales training that I had 20 years ago. I'm not in sales anymore, but avoid filling uncomfortable silences, because when you're trying to create urgency or fear, those are your friend, right? So if you are describing a gruesome scene, like in a recent game, I had a scene where the characters teleported into the middle of this city, and everyone was asleep. And there was no immediate cause. First of all, they didn't know if they were dead or asleep. That was a question I got, right? Are they dead or asleep? And I just shrugged my shoulders. I don't know. I knew they were asleep, but I didn't go, oh, they're asleep. You have to go check it out. Players are always going to pull the release valve on the tension. They're going to let the air out a little bit because they don't want it to be scary, right? Yeah. Knowing when to just shut up and let the moment speak for itself. And not rushing to fill in the tension because you're trying to create that tension. Your players are going to do that anyway. But that's my big thing is learn when to be quiet for a little while.
What do you think motivates players as far as fear? Is it enough to threaten to kill their PC? Is that what they're afraid of?
I don't know. That in this game in particular, the game I'm currently running, we talked about it last week, is an Apocalypse World conversion of Phoenix Dawn Command, and we can get into those again if we want to, but long story short, the characters are immortal, and the way you level up is to die. So death is not something to be completely avoided, though that can be a motivator. So in this game, what I try to do to create urgency or tension is uncertainty. Why is the thing that's occurring, why are these people all asleep? And how do you stop it? In that particular case, there was a huge army marching on the city, and they knew that was happening. That's why they were there. But they didn't know everybody was asleep or would be asleep when they got there. So they had a mission which was, let's go fortify this city and fight a huge battle to stop this army, to, holy crap, all the soldiers are asleep on the walls. What are we going to do? So misdirection, uncertainty about what they need to be doing, those kind of things create a lot of fear. But also, I think character death, certainly in a game like Call of Cthulhu, can be a motivator and create a lot of fear if you threaten them, because there are regular people in that game.
Yeah.
D&D is a weird hybrid because death is, it happens, right? But it's not with hit points as resource in that game the way it goes. That fear is not, like, you don't see death, unless you're really low level, you see death coming, right? Very rarely do mid to high level characters die suddenly. It can be very telegraphed, and that's a different experience, and I don't know if that creates fear or not.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, it's rarely a surprise in D&D and games like it when you die, right?
Yes.
And honestly, if you die in D&D, you probably are in this situation because you chose to take the risk, right? Because there's a lot of indicators in D&D that you're going to die before you actually hit the ground.
Well, let me put it this way. When my son dies in Minecraft, he's way more worried that somebody gets his stuff, right? Like he's playing with his friends. He knows he can come back. He really wants to know that somebody got his stuff, right? I don't know that creating fear of death necessarily is always the best case. It depends on the game, I guess.
It must be sort of a kid thing because my daughter running D&D games online for her middle school friends, reports that anytime somebody goes to sleep or falls unconscious or gets killed, it's just the rest of the party descends on their equipment like jackals. So there's motivation.
I think that's a middle school thing. Yeah,
I think so. So a lot of games out there, especially horror games, although there's variants of these mechanics, and even games like D&D have some sort of like a fear mechanic where you're rolling some dice or you're managing some resources to measure how freaked out your character is. Do you tend to like that sort of mechanic, or would you prefer players just role play it?
I like it because somebody said this about, we were on the Discord earlier today, and somebody said this, they liked skills in D&D because they were signposts to the way what your character should be trying to do, which I thought was a great statement. And I'll expand on that is that if you sort of have a level of sanity and it drops, that can be a signpost to how to role play. But if you got somebody who's really into role playing and they really want to do that, I mean, throw the mechanic out the window. But in general, I like those mechanics. In general, I like those mechanics because they're signposts. They don't tell you what you have to do. They say, it's getting worse. What does worse look like for you? And I think that's fun.
Yeah, when they're done well, they can add some nice tension if you start to sense that you're on a downward spiral, I guess, or that your resources are slowly running out. We just talked about D&D where you rarely are surprised. It's really a big surprise when you get killed. But there can be a sort of special dread when you see your resources dwindling, whether that's mental stability or, hit points in D&D or spells that you still have memorized, and just to realize that the stakes are going up. The farther down you go, the bigger the stakes are going to be for failure.
Absolutely. And what I like about a fear mechanic, let's talk about Call of Cthulhu again, what I like about that insanity mechanic is it's transparent, right? So everybody at the table knows, oh no, Andy's right on the edge here. Andy's character's, what's going to happen? I think it was in a Delta Green game I was playing where when you lost it, and maybe this happens in Call of Cthulhu too, it's been a long time since I play it, but you roll on a table and you could just randomly start shooting your gun at something, right? Like you don't have control of what your character is going to do. So there's a lot of tension about what's going to happen if you fail that last sanity check. And I find that can work really great.
Yeah.
The nice thing about sanity, too, is there's no easy way to recover it. Like with hit points, depends on your magic level in the game, right? You can be healed by a cleric or have a healing potion or something. With a fear or sanity mechanic, like, tough luck, man. If it goes south is pretty much the only way you're going.
So this is kind of tangentially related, but when you play D&D or D&D-ish games, do you use what you call the morale rules, either for the PCs or for like monsters? Like, how do you gauge when a creature is going to bow out of the situation or freak out or try to get away?
That is such a great question. I have never used a morale mechanic in my life. I think what I like to take in mind is the motivation of the creature. A hired creature is less motivated than a zealous cultist, right? Yeah. So how they respond, how they feel fear, whether or not they're willing to retreat, I think should be based on what their instinct is.
Yeah.
Have you used morale mechanics? I've been playing AD&D since it was AD&D in the early 80s, and I've never rolled morale in my life.
I have never really followed the morale is sort of one of those rules like encumbrance or something like that that it's in every rule book, but I question how many people use it. So there are situations, I don't know if I would exactly call this using the morale rules, but there are situations where I feel like it's borderline, like I'm not really sure if the kobolds have experienced enough stress that they would actually turn and run. So I will occasionally make just sort of an improvised morale roll of some sort, where I set the difficulty based on how dire their situation is. Right. And that's much less consistent than you would get if you were following the morale rules in every battle. But I've never heard of anyone really using the morale rules consistently like that.
It feels like a carryover from wargaming to me.
Right?
Like you're determining if your hirelings have morale to continue to fight.
Yep.
I think the player should be able to choose that for himself. I think it's exciting for a player to choose, I'm scared and I'm going to run. That's much more interesting than rolling a die and saying, you're scared, you have to run. You know what I mean? Because it's counter to what the player wants to do and kind of unfun.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This reminds me, this is the part of the show where I reminisce deep into my past, like I always do.
I love this part.
Some of the first times that I encountered some sort of a fear mechanic was playing like Rolemaster in Middle Earth, in which there are some spells and magical effects that like powerful creatures will have that will, there's powerful creatures in those systems that just radiate fear.
Yes.
And you have to roll to resist the fear, or your character just simply turns and runs. And I remember that for my group of young friends we were all playing, it felt really wrong to be rolling and to have the dice tell me that my character was too scared to go into the cave or to get closer to the monster, because there's an instinct of like, well, I'm just going to grit my teeth and do it. I guess this is a kind of a different topic that touches on kind of to what extent losing control of your character every now and then is fun or appropriate. But
right.
I wanted to ask a different question that isn't so much about the mechanical effects of fear in the game, but I'm curious, when you know that your game is going to have some scary moments, do you talk to your players beforehand? Do you use any one of the kind of the systems either for determining in advance what is going to bother them, or for permitting them in the middle of a scary situation to kind of raise a red flag about it?
Yeah, I do. I have not in my current campaign because I'm very familiar with all those players. I did sort of say at the beginning of that one, there's going to be some scary, gross stuff here. And sort of preface the campaign, like, so if you want to be here, that's going to be part of it. Prior than that, when it was a sort of group collaborative campaign building thing, I did go around and say, okay, everybody call out something that you just aren't down with. And, one person was really afraid of dogs. It was just their thing. And so I'm like, okay, there's not going to be any hellhounds. And so, everybody had sort of a thing. And then it turns out she was also afraid of frogs, I think it was. And I had some frog monster. And she's like, oh, by the way, I'm also afraid of frogs. So I have gone around and said, what is something that's just over the line? Somebody in that same game, somebody said strangulation. They think that the idea of that is creepy. And I always say torture. I'm like, I don't want to. Depictions of torture are not something I'm interested in a game. So I have gone around and said, what is over the line for you? And then I do stay away from it, because I think it would be bad. Some people I know find out what's over the line and then go after it, and I don't think that's a good idea. So
that's a very risky, and can be disrespectful if you're doing that. But yes. I do something similar. I'm not running a horror game right now, but I will at least issue general notice about sort of is this PG-13? It helps that I don't mind kind of violence and gore, but anything really that you would call disturbing, I mean, I'm probably more conservative in that respect than a lot of the people I play with. So
and I will often, if I'm running a campaign with strangers, I will either have an X card, which I've done at conventions, or I'll just say, hey gang, this game is PG-13. Right? So and I'll joke, then you can say the F word once or whatever. But so I will sort of dictate. But when it's a longer running campaign, I will solicit feedback on what is appropriate or not.
All right. Well, we should probably wrap up before too terribly long. Is there anything else on the topic of fear that you wanted to share or that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I think it's important that there's a difference between, and I think this is the distinction I'm making, creating urgency and creating fear. And I think all good action-oriented stories, not all good stories, but all the action-oriented stories that you would engage in an RPG, and actually I shouldn't say all RPGs, I know that there's a Jane Austen RPG, which probably doesn't rely heavily on a sense of urgency or fear,
right,
or a different kind of urgency, is that I think you can't play one of these adventure-based games without creating urgency, but there is a difference between that and fear. I think we've talked a little bit about both today, but I think learning how to create urgency that keeps your players motivated and interested in the game is critical, and fear might be a tool to do that.
There is that line to be trod. We talked about how it would be disrespectful to take what you know about what freaks out the players and then use it against them. To the extent that your players are down with it, it can be fun to personalize the situation a little bit, as long as you're not going to upset your players. Or
I think that's a great, like, a circumstance where a character describes a fear that is not the player's fear, and then you say, hey, this thing is occurring that you're afraid of, and use it as a cue to them to act to role play to be fearful. And I think having characters have fears that are separate from the player fear can be a great tool there too.
Do you run horror games very much? I mean, you mentioned your Halloween game. You obviously have some familiarity with Delta Green, Call of Cthulhu.
I love horror movies and horror games. I'm often too afraid to watch modern horror movies, actually. And I do not run as many horror games as I would like. I played 10 Candles. The other candidate there was Dread, which has the mechanic of the Jenga tower. Have you heard of this one?
I have. What a lovely idea.
Yeah, and every time you want to do something, you have to remove a Jenga piece. So I love the idea of a horror game, but I don't run a regular one, and it almost feels more like a one-shot kind of thing. Though, if you could get a Monster of the Week game to work and make it sort of like Supernatural, the TV show, that might be interesting. I wonder if I'd run out of ways to scare the players after a while, though.
Isn't that a challenge with any sort of a horror game
Yes.
these days? Everyone at the table knows all about the Lovecraft mythology or the Alien movies or whatever it is that you're throwing at them, right? So
Yes. But I do long to create situations that have the characters in fear and maybe the players a little bit while respecting their boundaries, and that's a tough balance, but I do try to do it. Even in a non-horror game, I do create horrific moments.
Are there any types of fear or horror situations that you don't know how you would be able to reproduce in a tabletop game?
Ooh, that's a great one. One hard one is that sort of isolation one, the buried alive kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that would be hard to recreate in an RPG.
Yeah. There's one that I would flag that I would love to be able to emulate this in a game, but it's a little bit specific to the zombie genre. I like zombie movies and the zombie genre in general. And there's this moment in every zombie movie where you transition abruptly from feeling secure to everything starts to fall apart, and you have this cascading collapse of your security. It all, there's always that peaceful moment in the middle act of the movie where they find the safe haven and everything looks like it's going to be great. And then one little thing happens, and then it progressively gets worse and worse. And watching those films, it creates this, you sort of watch in passive horror as everything that the characters have worked for unravels around them.
Yes.
And that is something I would love to be able to capture in a game, but it just feels like it would take so much setup to make it work. I can't think how I would do it.
You should read 10 Candles, because it's kind of like that. They sort of lose themselves piece by piece, and things unravel piece by piece. So I recommend at least reading through that.
So you've mentioned a couple of games already that sound amazing. Is there a game out there you can think of that handles fear in an interesting way, either thematically or through its mechanics?
Well, I'll mention Dread again. The fear, because that is a game that induces fear in the players.
Yeah.
And so that mechanic of having to pull Jenga pieces out, and then when they fall, your character dies, is one of my favorite mechanics for a horror game or a fear-inducing game that I've seen.
I've always been a fan. I don't know if it's exactly a horror game, but the role-playing game Unknown Armies. Are you familiar with that one?
I've heard of it, but I've never played it. I'm very curious about it.
So I know there's a new edition that I don't know anything about, but I played the second edition of it, back when it was in print. And it invests a lot of mechanical energy in defining the different elements of your mental stability. So instead of one fear track or a sanity meter, it's got, you have several different meters really that all add up to sort of your ability to keep it together and to
interesting.
Remain human and true to yourself in special situations. And watching those dials all tick down and realizing that you're watching the disintegration of the slow disintegration of your character without any easy way back is a neat feel. I've experienced that playing Unknown Armies, and I've experienced that sort of thrill of fear for my character. I haven't run Unknown Armies in a very long time, but I'm fond of that one. I hope that the new edition.
I'm super curious about that.
Now I know you mentioned Delta Green. I've played only in I played in a convention game of Delta Green, the new Delta Green, but help me understand. That game specifically makes you track some of your like dependencies and sources of stability and your loved ones. Is that right? I assume that's for the purpose of...
The version I played was based on Call of Cthulhu, so it was really just Call of Cthulhu, but with the Delta Green serial numbers on it. So there was... I lost my sanity in the same way you would lose it in Call of Cthulhu.
Got it.
Yeah.
So, I think that the new edition, and listeners can correct me if I'm wrong, goes a little bit further into having you define when you're creating your character the things that allow them to be brave in the face of horror. And I assume that the reason those are defined is because the game master has tools for threatening those or wrecking them for you.
Right.
Which sounds like a nice, creepy... It sounds like it has a potential at least to be a nice, scary experience.
You know, I'll give a shout out to one other game since Chris isn't here. Blades in the Dark doesn't necessarily have a fear mechanic, but it has a stress mechanic. And when you have too much stress, you kind of fall apart. And it has a similar kind of thing in that you have ways that you can relieve your stress. Okay, and none of them are healthy, right? They're like drinking or gambling or, something like that. So I kind of like that mechanic too. I've only played in a short campaign of Blades, so my stress never got so bad that I had to worry about any of that stuff. But I did like the idea that I was, if you want to spend a stress, you can do this thing, that sort of sanity or mental health as currency, right? Yeah. Spend a stress and you can do this, you can succeed at this thing, but you don't want to spend too much of your stress, right? Yeah. So I like that mechanic, like you have to make a choice. Spending this resource to accomplish your goal at the risk of your own mental health was kind of an interesting mechanic that I liked.
Yep. All right, so last question for you. So Halloween is still, as of the time of this recording, it's many months away. But
yes.
So if Halloween turned up next week, what would you run?
I would run Dread, because I've never run it, and I really, really want to run it. And I almost ran it this last Halloween, and then somebody said, well, we could play Dread, but have you heard of 10 Candles? And I read the rules, and I'm like, oh, I guess we're playing 10 Candles. So I still have never run that game and really want to see what it's like. How about you?
Yeah, for me, I picked up the new Alien role-playing game a couple months ago.
From Modiphius?
Yes, and it would take I would need to invest some time in wrapping my head around the experience I wanted to produce with that. But I will say, it's a game that's pretty well engineered to reproduce the experience of watching an Alien movie.
Well, it has two modes, right? There's a campaign mode,
yes,
which doesn't make any sense to me. But then there's the cinematic mode, which sounds really interesting in terms of mechanics for creating fear, because you're basically, it's sort of like everybody's going to die kind of thing.
Yes,
and how it's going to happen is the game.
And you have stress compounding as the session goes on. Just promising bad stuff to come, but you got to keep pressing through anyway.
And I can't believe we made it all, and we're at the end of the episode, unfortunately. Shout out to Mothership, which I did run at a convention last year, and had a lot of fun. And actually, that was more about an atmosphere thing for me. The players in that game managed to escape without serious injury, which was very disappointing. But
yes.
but because I think I scared them too much, and they're like, "Okay, we're leaving."
Yep.
So
I
but
played
a good game for fear. I liked it.
For sure. I played a really enjoyable game of Mothership at Gen Con last year as well, and it was a good creepy experience as well. Okay, but we've been kind of rambling on here for a while, so why don't we wrap this up? Once again, I want to thank you, John, for coming on the show to co-host. I think you'll be, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, joining us a couple of times more. And I'd like to thank our listeners, of course. If you have questions, comments, reactions, complaints, if you want to correct something that we said that was incorrect about your favorite game, please do so on Twitter or wherever else you want. This has been an episode of Roll for Topic. I've been Andy Rao.
And I've been John Corey.
And as Chris always says to close our episodes, remember, if your players are having fun, you are a great GM.
All right.